And I'm not trying to I'm not trying to reduce performance to a science, but I'm just trying to enhance understanding of performance through science, because it's a field that's often not incorporated much seriously into performance theory. And there's a lot of interesting work that's happening with performance studies that is heading towards this direction. And so this is why I came to this program, because neuroscience as a field academically doesn't focus enough on performance, and I come from a performance background. So I hope you find this as interesting as I do. And also because I assume that we're a mixed audience, a lot of what I'm going to say is not going to be extremely jargon heavy. It's going to be much more general. Just to give you an idea of what the field is like, I don't assume that everybody knows about neuroscience in depth, but just have an awareness of, if I say cortex, what do I mean? It means it means the visible surface area of the brain is generally the cortex. What is the subcortex? What is the subcortex? It's all these structures that are hidden underneath the cortex. And that's all I really assume that everybody needs to know. Paris, excellent job today. I really liked the manifesto. I asked pointed questions for a reason. Okay, so I'm going to just start right now. So, good morning, everybody. As you can see, today's workshop is entitled Art is in the Eye of the Beholder, exploring neuroscience, aesthetics, and performance. And so in the background you see actually an artist's depiction of a hippocampal neuron. And the hippocampus is a subcortical structure in the brain which actually deals with memory. And next to the hippocampus is the amygdala. And that is another region that's closely linked to the hippocampus, and it's involved in emotional processing. So this becomes important to aesthetics later on, as you'll see. So what I'm hoping to do today in today's workshop is to give everybody a nice overview of the field that I'm interested in called neuroaesthetics. And essentially what it is, it's a field of study which is very nascent, and it's at the crossroads between performance studies and neuroscience. So today's workshop is essentially going to be divided into three parts. First, I'm going to provide a historical overview of neuroaesthetics as a field of research, where it comes from, what informs it, what is currently happening right now, and where it's headed towards. And then an examination of some of the current research practices. And finally, a discussion of some of the major issues with research methodology and approach to neuroaesthetics. And I have a small surprise for you. Despite my injury, I'm actually going to do a small demonstration which is very relevant to this workshop and later on in the presentation. So let's begin with a quotation by Dr. Samir Zeki, who is actually a London-based neurobiologist, and he's one of the pioneers of neuroaesthetics. And he says, "The artist is in a sense a neuroscientist, exploring the potentials and capacities of the brain, though with different tools. How such creations can arouse aesthetic experiences can only be fully understood in neural terms. Such understanding is well within our reach." I chose this quotation because it beautifully captures the intention of neuroaesthetics as a field of study. But he raises two interesting points that are actually major sites of contention, whether it's from the performance studies perspective or from the neuroscience perspective. And that specifically refers to, can something as complex as the human aesthetic experience be fully explained neurologically, or through neuroanatomy, or through physiology? And secondly, does neuroaesthetics have the research methodology and practices in place to be able to study something as complex as the human aesthetic experience? And we'll start to examine these questions later on in the workshop. So what exactly is neuroaesthetics? As I said, it's a nascent field of research which has come about in the past 10 years or so in terms of maturity. And it is a field of research which examines the neural basis of the human aesthetic experience, and it draws from neurobiology, psychology, and philosophy. And so to borrow a more specific definition of what aesthetics is, I'm taking it from Nadal and Pierce's 2011 article, which is actually a great read if you're interested. I have actually compiled an email list for anybody who might be interested in this topic further. I can email you information. I can answer any questions that you may have. And so what they say is that neuroaesthetics examines the cognitive and affective processes engaged in response to a work of art, a non-artistic object, or a natural phenomenon. And so for today's workshop, we're going to focus on works of art, mainly in performance. And they also state that neuroaesthetics is a subdiscipline of empirical aesthetics, and more recently, cognitive neuroscience and neuropsychology. So these are the major fields of research that neuroaesthetics draws from. So let's now look at a historical overview of neuroaesthetics. So we can safely say, based upon my research and the research of others in neuroaesthetics, that since the 18th century, artists, philosophers, psychologists, scientists, and other thinkers have been interested in the physiological basis of aesthetic creation and appreciation. And so we can roughly divide the timeline, the early timeline of neuroaesthetics, with the 1700s and the 1800s and early 1900s. So what happened generally in the 1700s was that there were early theories in empirical aesthetics from German and British philosophers. And today we're going to look at Baumgarten, Burke, and Kant in sort of cursory detail. And secondly, in the 1800s and early 1900s, this is when you start to see empirical aesthetics and physiology start to converge to the work of Darwin, Clay, Fechner, and Marshall. So let's begin with some of the early theories of aesthetics. Beauty, for those of you who are familiar with aesthetic theory, there are primarily two criteria that are there for the aesthetic experience in Western notions of aesthetics. And I say Western deliberately because one of the main issues that we will discuss is the notion of Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy when it comes to aesthetics. So early theories of Western philosophy of aesthetics concern themselves with beauty and sublimity as the main criteria for the aesthetic experience. But Baumgarten is significant because he was the first to use aesthetics in its modern connotation of taste, as in taste in terms of works of art, taste in terms of clothing and whatnot. And this is from his 1739 work, Metaphysica. And he defines aesthetics as the ability to judge according to the senses and not according to the intellect. I paraphrase. So one of Baumgarten's contemporaries, Edmund Burke, who was a British philosopher, he expands on the notion of taste in aesthetics, but also starts to introduce physiology into his theories of aesthetics, and this can be seen in his 1757 work, A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of the Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful. So what's interesting about Burke is that he bases his theories on speculation, which happens to be quite correct, but he lacks the physiological research, the evidence in terms of physiology, in terms of neuroscience, to really back up his claims. So as a result, he was largely dismissed by his contemporaries. But what makes Burke significant is that he says that aesthetic perception stems from the sensations and the physiological and psychological responses to them. And in particular, when he talks about beauty, look at what he says. Beauty has, quote, a natural tendency to relax the body's fibers, to produce physical experiences of pleasure and love. So keep in mind, during the 1700s when Burke was writing, little was known about neuroanatomy, the nervous system, or the way in which muscles actually work. So it's interesting that he calls it body's fibers. And so beauty causes the body's fibers to relax and produces the physical experiences of pleasure and love. So in other words, he's equating pleasure and love and those physical experiences with the idea of the perception of beauty in the aesthetic sense. And likewise, the mechanisms that give rise to physical pain, which he doesn't know about, also cause the terrifying sensations while perceiving a sublime object. So right away you see the link between physiology of the body and the aesthetic experience are one and the same. So one of the most notable and vocal detractors of Burke was Immanuel Kant, and he needs no introduction in the field of aesthetics. So in his 1790 work, The Critique of Judgement, he basically dismisses Burke for quite a bit of the book. And he argues, his main argument is that Burke reduces the transcendental human aesthetic experience to just psychological observations based on the physical perception of an object. In other words, he feels that Burke just reduces something as intangible, as subjective, as the human aesthetic experience to just something highly empirical. And this is a point of contention in the field of neuroaesthetics at the moment as well. These arguments still persist. And so one of his other arguments is that he dissociates the physical experiences of pleasure and pain, which we talked about in Burke, from the aesthetic experiences of beauty and sublimity. And so what is also interesting about Kant is that though he attacks Burke's approach, he also is not entirely dismissive of it. And so he actually says that in order for a judgment to happen aesthetically, you have to start with the physical perception of the object. He also is in line with Burke in that sense. But what happens is that once you initially perceive of an object, there has to be some sort of internal transformation that happens within the mind to give rise to an aesthetic judgment. Any questions so far? Great. So now let's move to the 1800s, the mid-1800s in particular, through the work of Charles Darwin. Again, a thinker who needs no introduction. But what is interesting about Darwin's Origin of Species, not only was it contentious, but it was widely influential. Darwin highlights the crucial role of aesthetics in his theory of natural selection. I'm sure most of you are familiar with natural selection, survival of the fittest. So he says in his work, the most vigorous males with special weapons will be preferentially selected by females to yield the most viable offspring. So what exactly are those special weapons he talks about? His special weapons are actually based upon instinctual notions of beauty. And so he uses a very interesting case study with Guyanese birds of paradise, and he quotes, and I quote, "If a man can in short time give beauty and elegant carriage," meaning a male bird, "to his bantams, according to his standard of beauty. Female birds, by selecting during thousands of generations the most melodious or beautiful males, according to their standard of beauty, might produce a marked effect." So right away, the key words, standard of beauty. The most melodious or beautiful males. Standard of beauty again. So these are all aesthetic terms that are clearly implicated in evolutionary biology that Darwin himself had pioneered. And so what you see is that we use instinctual notions of aesthetics. We look for beauty to find the optimal mate or the habitat to live in order to what? Perpetuate our population, to produce viable offspring, to survive. So Darwin didn't explicitly state this. In fact, one of his followers, Felix Clay. So forgive me, I don't have biographical details of Felix Clay, and I'm still not able to find for some reason. So I assume that he's a British philosopher, but not much else is known about him. But he wrote this treatise called The Origin of Aesthetic Emotion in 1908. And he is the one who carried Darwin's theories of natural selection, sexual selection further, and linked it intimately with empirical aesthetics. And so what he says is, and I reiterate, humans have some innate natural desire or instinctive feeling for a particular form, a certain combination of color, a particular sequence of sounds which gives them a selective advantage. So right away you see that we use instinctual notions of aesthetics in order to critically assess our environment. We seek out beauty, and sublimity, to an extent, kind of also guides our actions. And we try to seek out optimal habitats and mates for survival and for procreation. Now, Gustave Fechner came around the same time as Darwin and just before Clay. And I place him here because he's not exactly directly influenced by Darwin, but why he's important is that he was regarded as the founder of experimental psychology. And he was also the first theorist at this time to empirically evaluate the perception of beauty. So why Fechner is important is because he was one of the first to use the classic scientific model for experimentation in psychology. So he conducted a rudimentary experiment based on around the idea of the golden rectangle. Can anyone tell me what the golden rectangle is? Anybody? So the golden rectangle is a very special rectangle of a particular proportion. And what's interesting about it is that it persists throughout the centuries, whether it's in architecture, whether it's in art, or in nature itself. There is this idea of symmetry and proportion that's represented by the golden rectangle. And this has persisted throughout various cultures and for centuries. And so he uses this as a concrete measure of beauty in his 1873 work. And so Fechner correctly hypothesized that subjects who were shown various rectangles of variable lengths and widths would prefer rectangles that are closely confining to the proportions that are there in the golden rectangle. And this becomes significant because Fechner, through his rudimentary experiment, is implying that certain things in aesthetics persist and are inherited and are sort of passed on from generation to generation. And this becomes the crux of the argument given by people who are in evolutionary biology. And in terms of psychology as well, because it's predictable human behavior. So what's interesting is that alongside the work that's done in psychology, evolutionary biology, and empirical aesthetics, what you get during the 1800s and early 1900s again are very, very significant advances in neuroscience. And so just to give you an example, Paul Broca and Carl Wernicke discovered and identified several areas of the cortex which are responsible for language development and comprehension, very specific sites. And this becomes important because neuroscience as a field has been trying to study the executive functions of various parts of the brain. Camilo Golgi and Santiago Ramon y Cajal are also significant because they made advances in neuroanatomy. They developed staining techniques which stain individual neurons so that you can study the ways in which they link to one another, and their just anatomy in general and how they function. And because of their efforts, Ramon y Cajal in particular developed this thing called the neuron doctrine, in which states that neurons are contiguously linked. So you have a neuron, and then the next neuron. They're not continuously linked. They don't flow into one another, but there's a gap between them called a synapse. And Ramon y Cajal was the pioneer of this theory, and this continues in neuroscience today. It's been proven and seen and observed. And this becomes significant because we're going to talk about approaches to the way in which behavior manifests or comes about neurologically speaking. And finally, Brodmann creates a neuroanatomical map of the brain. And this becomes significant because with these advances, people start understanding where things happen in the brain. So if this behavior happens, where does it manifest in the brain? Oh, it manifests in this part. What is this part? Brodmann's area kind of gives you an indication of where things happen. And it's based on the spatial and structural organization of cells, not function. So now let's look at the work of Marshall, because he was the first, during this golden period of neuroscience, as many scholars like to call it. He was the first theorist to really integrate Burke's physiological theory of aesthetics with the latest discoveries in neuroscience. But he does it only to an extent because he's limited by the fact that much of how the brain functions at this time is not known. So he wrote this work in 1894 called Plain Pleasure and Aesthetics, which is a classic read, and it's also very easy to understand, so I recommend that as well. So the thing about Marshall is that he developed these theories which form the basis of many of the approach in modern neuroscience called bottom-up processing. And again, it's not Marshall's original work, it's works that are gleaned from what the empirical aesthetics have been saying since the 1700s. You start with a stimulus, or an object, so to speak, and you perceive it, physically or by sight or whatnot, and that information is transmitted into the central nervous system, CNS, the central nervous system, via the peripheral nerves, via the optic nerve, or up through the spinal cord into the brain, the higher cortical areas for further processing. So this is sort of the general approach to ways in which you respond to something. in the environment. And so Marshall sort of outlined this, rudimentally speaking, in his work. And so more importantly, in continuing with Burke's thought about there being a pathway for pain, a pathway for pleasure, Marshall responds by saying that yes, there are distinct neurological pathways that exist, and they each have a special locus in the brain. So, meaning that there is a specific site in the cortex, or wherever in the brain, that processes pain, that processes pleasure, that processes beauty. But at the same time, he doesn't make this a definitive statement, because he argues that without knowing the function of each part of the brain, how can we make the assumption that pain is going to be localized here? Beauty is going to be localized here. Pleasure is going to be here. So he says, and this is a direct quote, "We're unable to assert the relations of activity traceable in the ear when we bring about a harmony of sound," again, aesthetics, "or in the eye when we appreciate composite colors." And so he says, which are held in the brain regions, and he claims these to be the real physical seat of activity, which gives us to consciousness. Notice he said consciousness of these sounds and colors. He doesn't say aesthetic appreciation. So we end with the early history of neuroaesthetics with what I call an unmitigated disaster, which is taken from a direct quotation from a review article that I read. Because what you see is that in empirical aesthetics you have this research going on. In neuroscience you have these advances going on. Evolutionary biology, you have these things going on. Psychology, you're having these things going on. So Marshall was unable to really, truly reconcile these glaring disparities between various fields to create a cohesive theory of aesthetics that is physiologically based. And so also the problem with Darwin is that Darwin was unable to take his theories beyond instinctual notions of aesthetics and how they relate to behavior. He only looked at survival. He only looked at mate selection. But he couldn't really explain things like aesthetic appreciation of art. Likewise, Kant was too subjective in his ideas of what is beautiful and what is sublime. And so Fechner's experiment reveals that there are certain patterns of behavior in terms of aesthetic response that persist. And you can see that through his rudimentary experiment. And finally, what you have with Fechner is that he can only explain something, again, instinctual through his experiment, but not something more complex, like appreciating a work of art. Are there patterns of behavior in that? He didn't have the framework or the technology to do so. What was also an unmitigated disaster was in psychology, because when I went back to looking at why there's a big gap between the 1800s and 1900s to 1940, which we'll see in a second, for me, I felt like, well, psychology could have provided a lens by which to look at and integrate all these different fields together. On the one hand, you can get something subjective like Freud and look at the aesthetic experience in that lens and incorporate neuroscience into that. Or you can look at it from what is called behaviorist, which looks at observable phenomena. So why is this an unmitigated disaster? Aesthetics is generally inherently subjective, though there are certain aspects of it which persist. We seek out very specific things that we can all share. But what was happening in psychology was that Freudian psychology was being directly confronted by a new field of study called behaviorism. So what behaviorists say, and B.F. Skinner is one of the notable proponents of it, psychology should exclusively focus on observable behavior and not on unobservable phenomena that take place within the mind. So as a result, you're getting a fascination in psychology with just external behavior, things that can be observed among many different types of people, which have a higher rate in which you can treat them effectively, and doesn't focus on the subjective experiences like aesthetics. And so research in aesthetics, especially on the physiological basis of that, sort of declined from the 1900s onwards because of the domination of behaviorist psychology. Any questions so far? So let's now jump to the 1940s. So this is not to say that there was no research going on, but there were no significant landmark studies being done in this field until the 1940s, because you start having the emergence of hybrid fields, interdisciplinary fields of research, like neuropsychology. And so neuropsychologists during the 1940s, in terms of aesthetics, were looking at studies that examined these specific brain injuries and how it impacts creation and perception of visual art and music. This becomes significant later on, and I'll explain why. Secondly, during the 1940s, there was the discovery of reward centers in the brain. Not just parts of the brain that process reward, but whole neurological systems. And this becomes important again to neuroaesthetics, and we'll see why in a second. And so researchers started looking at reward and its link to aesthetics. And finally, there were precise psychological tests that were being developed at this time, along with statistical analyses which allowed researchers to start objectively measuring aesthetic perception. So these are the advances in neuropsychology which have fed into neuroaesthetics as a field today. Finally, in evolutionary biology, which is again something that research was continuing in it throughout the early 1900s during World War I, during the Great Depression. But for our benefit in terms of neuroaesthetics, we're going to look at the 1940s again. So there were advances in genetics, discovery of DNA, RNA, and all those kinds of things, and all of that led to hybrid fields again within biology. Sociobiology was a field of study which examines how genes drive basic human behavior. And so like behaviorism, sociobiology had its share of critics. And again, arguing that how can genes explain things like cultural and external factors which influence behavior? But at the same time, researchers in sociobiology also revealed through various studies, which I can send you separately, certain aesthetic principles such as symmetry and balanced representation are hereditary and universally encoded in the brain. So there are studies with stick figures done with children, stick figures done with adults, which you saw certain patterns in terms of symmetry and sort of like balanced representation of the body. Hands will generally be a proportionate size, similar. Those kinds of things in terms of aesthetic perception of beauty have been found to be consistent among large populations. These studies are not perfect, but they were quite revealing nevertheless. So let's move on to the present, current research in neuroaesthetics. So neuroscience, in terms of becoming a very specialized discipline, started to happen again in the 1940s with the advent of neuropsychology and cognitive neuroscience. All these fields started to really make neuroscience an integrated discipline in its own right. So over the past 20 years or so, actually more like 30 years, neuroscience, psychology, evolutionary biology, and even aesthetics started to diverge as researchers became more specialized in their fields. So, as I said earlier, neuroscience research initially focused on trying to understand what it is that these various parts of the brain do. What are their executive function? What are they responsible for? And so you get the frontal cortex is responsible for processing and decision making. The parietal cortex is responsible for muscular movement. Very generalized regions and very generalized executive functions. But what they end up finding later on, as we'll see, is that they started looking at patterns of behavior once the technology to examine brain waves and all that started to come about, and how various aspects of behavior, and in terms of aesthetics, various aspects of the aesthetic experience manifest. So currently, because of research done with technology, we start seeing neuroscientists rejecting the old model, like this part of the brain does this, that part of the brain does that, in favor of something more systemic, especially because now they're able to start studying more complex behavior. See, let me give you an example. In this part of the brain, this is called Broca's area. So this very specific part, if this is lesioned or damaged, you have difficulty producing language, though you can understand it. So you get people who stammer, who are at a loss for words. But that's one of very few regions which have a very specific function that you can see manifest in a big way. Whereas a lot of other things like, memory encoding, perception, visual or physical perception, attention that you give to something, decision making, what is rewarding. These are all not just site-specific things, but they're actually a systemic phenomenon. Like, it involves various structures, whether they're subcortical structures or whether they're cortical structures. They're all linked, and like how they're linked and how they get activated is becoming the focal point of research now. Integrative. Because something complex like the human aesthetic experience cannot be confined to just one particular region of the brain. You're involving the eyes, you're involving the ears, you're involving memory, you're involving decision making, you're involving, is this rewarding or pleasing to me? These are all things that require different parts of the brain coordinated in some sort of way. And so the last major innovation that has given rise to neuroaesthetics as a field is neuroimaging. And so what neuroimaging allows researchers to do is to be able to objectively study, objectively I mean objectively, and isolate specific neural structures in healthy individuals while being tested in a controlled environment. Do you remember what I said about in the 1940s with that research, where we're looking at brain lesions and how they impact behavior? Well, now you don't have to wait for a client who has that particular brain injury to understand how normal behavior manifests. And so with neuroimaging, you're able to test individuals who are healthy or otherwise in a laboratory setting. And so some of the technology that's available to us is fMRI, which I'll show you in just a second. So on the left is an fMRI scan, and this corresponds to blood flow. So, as a sign of activation, it's not a very reliable marker. Technology is slowly improving in this. When you get exposed to music, certain areas of the brain receive more blood flow, meaning that they're probably more activated at that time. But again, it's not perfect, but it gives you a rough idea of where things light up in the brain. And likewise, a PET scan does the same thing. Blood flow also affects temperature. And positron emission technology looks at that. So you get something similar, but unlike the fMRI scan, which gives you a 3D model, PET scan is flat. And that's the only difference between the two that you really need to know. So finally, this is a concluding part of my talk, is some of the problems that are there in neuroaesthetics. I say biases, not necessarily problems per se, because neuroaesthetics is still a nascent field, and there's a lot of room for growth in it. But we've been talking about European theorists, and we've also been talking about Western notions of aesthetics. And so as a result, you find that neuroaesthetics is a field that is largely Western-centric in its approach, and in terms of the art it analyzes. And so, let me give you an example. There's a 2011 study by Bromberger and colleagues, and they were looking at the right hemisphere's involvement in aesthetic perception of visual art. So now visual art runs the gamut, right? We have Eastern visual art, we have African visual art, we have European visual art, we have continental European visual art, we have contemporary art. It runs the gamut. So why did these people in a 2011 study only pick works that were by well-known Western artists? I just give you three. There was like 12. Among them was Leonardo da Vinci, Picasso, Van Eyck, and Dali. So this sets you up into a trap, because most of us are familiar with Picasso's work, right? We have sort of a pre-configured idea that this is art, that this is a work of art, that this is a master working on it. And that sets up a confounding variable in the study. So is this a really true aesthetic experience? Is this really a true aesthetic judgment that we're making about a work of art? Or is it something that is contextual, that we base it upon what we already know and what we relate to? These are the questions that make neuroaesthetics problematic and very subjective at the same time. So how do you quantify this in terms of an experimental paradigm and in terms of methodology? This is where neuroaesthetics is struggling at the moment. And so what you see in my research so far, there have been very few studies that have even remotely dealt with either like Eastern or non-Western notions of aesthetics, or even non-Western art forms. Out of like maybe hundreds of studies that I was going through and panning, I only came across literally 3 studies that had anything to do with Eastern art. And so this particular study by Osaka et al. From Japan, they investigated Japanese no-mas. Is everybody familiar with Japanese no? So it's a dance drama tradition, more or less. And they examined the role of the amygdala. Who remembers what the amygdala does? I said at the very beginning, quiz time. Yes? Exactly. So they're looking at emotional and aesthetic processing in a Japanese concept of delicate sadness. Now, delicate sadness is a very, very Japanese contextual term, because it talks about the aesthetic presentation of sadness in their tradition. Whether it's through poetry, whether it's through visual art, or whether it's through drama. It's a very particular state which makes sadness beautiful, sadness as fragile, but highly aesthetic in terms of Japanese notions of aestheticism. And so another lack that you see in neuroaesthetics research is that there is the performing arts in general, whether it's Eastern or Western performing arts, is very scant compared to visual art. And most of the published studies on a performing art of some sort is on Western music. Whether it's with a live orchestra or a live ensemble in the laboratory, or whether it's something that you hear. The extent to which performance is investigated in neuroaesthetics is largely confined to music. And so why do we have so many studies concentrating on visual art and music? In my opinion, it's because they're easier to control in a laboratory setting. So imagine that you are a subject in a laboratory, and you're hooked up to this fMRI scanner. Imagine you have, so in visual art is just presented right here in front of you. Music can be just right here in front of you, and you can hear it. Most of the time, if it's with a live band, they usually just cover the eyes so that there isn't an extra variable of sight involved. You're just engaging the auditory system or the visual system. And so the second point is that it also relies less on external factors in order to create an aesthetic experience, or to enhance the presentation. You can sort of look at a work of art, relatively speaking, with more ease, without specific lighting, without specific space. You can hear music without necessarily having to hear it in a symphony hall, or without having to see the orchestra. So those make it easy. So these aspects make it easier for people to control in a laboratory setting, or in a situation in which you have to control for external variables. And so I feel like that's the reason why most researchers are now focusing just on these two, because it's easier in terms of the methodology that's already in place to investigate. Does that make sense? So just to illustrate my point a little bit further, I'm actually going to do a small demonstration, which I hope will sort of illuminate why exactly performing arts in general become more difficult to work with in a laboratory setting, or in terms of in terms of the scientific experimental paradigm. So I'm not going to tell you what I'm doing. Okay, so what I was doing right now was just movement in the Indian classical dance style, but without anything, just movement by itself. What were the feelings that you got from it? Anybody?
If I would take a guess, at least I think the first part it was some kind of love declaration, like a courting.
Okay.
Courting?
Anybody else? Yes? Okay. So now I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to add one variable to it. Oops, sorry. Okay. What are your impressions now? I'll give it just a few minutes to ruminate. Yes?
Well, through the music, it appeared to me more like a dance. The first time it was theatrical,
Mm-hmm.
and with the music, it was more dance.
Cool. Anybody else?
I got more sense in the second one of the feeling of deference to something higher power, more higher status
Mm-hmm.
being of some kind.
Yes?
I felt as though you were trying to get people just in the dance.
Mm-hmm. So you see how music, immediately you start getting more inferences about something. I'm going to add a third variable now. Now I'm going to share with you the context of what I just did. And I'm going to do it once more with music. So the song Rupamu Juchi, Valachi Vachitini. So Rupamu is one's form, Rupamu, and you're right, it's dedicated to a god. But in this case, it's just an object of affection. Whether it's a man or a woman, doesn't matter. In this case, I know the larger context of the song, so that doesn't matter. For now, let's just assume there's somebody, Rupamu Juchi, whose form, Juchi, I see. I saw your form. Valachi is love. Valachi, I fell in love. Vachi tinis, and I came to you. Kopamu, this indifference, this anger, this feigned put on anger. Doing so, seya kura, don't do. So kopamu, seya kura, don't do that. Swami is, again, you're correct, a moment of deference. This is a formal way of saying you to somebody with respect. Swami, yinta. What is this now? So right away you get, so now I did the context, right? So it's very simple. I saw you and I fell in love and I came to you. Why are you disregarding me? Why are you angry with me, O Lord? I'll do it once more and see what your impressions are now that I've done it with context.
Rupamu Juchi
Yes?
A very strong sense of space and distance and pace. I think that is why it's difficult for neuroscience to monitor in the lab.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
Anybody else who haven't spoken yet? Yes?
But I don't know, for me it was really interesting because I got the notion of language in the whole perspective, and how
exactly.
actually language gives meaning, that in a way you like juxtapose from one side the meaning and from the other side like emotion that you say.
Exactly.
And in a way like language, it restricts like the translation that emotions can do. This is how I felt it, that it was guided somehow.
Exactly. So you can see that language, music, intention, subcontext, all that play into the performing arts, because it not only is moving and dynamic, but it also engages multiple sensory systems. And so this is why it becomes difficult to control something like this. I did the best of my ability to make sure I did the same 6 movements, same 6 lines each time, and I was trying to control like I would in a laboratory setting. Like I didn't change Valachi to something else the first time. I did the same hand gestures, the same expressions, as much as I could, but we're all human. Bound to have small variations here and there. I believe it was Derrida who talked about iteration with differences. So despite my efforts to try and control like you would in a scientific experiment, something that's human and subjective like performance is very hard to sort of translate in a laboratory setting. So this brings us to a summarizing point about non-visual art and its presentation in a laboratory setting in neurosthetics and why it's problematic and hard. So dance or theater, for example, involve multiple sensory modalities. You not only have to see it, you often have to hear it, you often might have to sometimes touch it, you might also have to sometimes feel it effectively as well. So this relies on, it engages very, very distinct systems, neurological systems in the brain. So how do you control for vision when you're watching a dance, when you're just watching movement, without context or without music? Also, performance in general, whether it's dance, music, or even or theater or something like that, how do you control for external factors when the very fact that performance relies so much on external factors to create an aesthetic experience of some sort? Whether it's through the lighting, through the space, through the sound, costumes, etc. And of course, as we had mentioned, context, as Paris so beautifully put it with language, context becomes important in a performance for aesthetic appreciation, more so than visual art. And I use that, and that's a point of contention right there. I know that for sure. It's going to be that I just said a polarizing comment. But compared to performance, visual art relies less on these external factors in order to appreciate it. And also, it's challenging to present and control in a laboratory setting. So for the performer who is actually part of the experiment, or the spectator, it becomes very difficult to sort of have a unified response to something, or unified execution to something that oftentimes demands to be done in a scientific experiment. We have to replicate results. So what I may have done the first time may not be the same the second time, or with the second group of subjects. So this is the problem with performance in neurosthetics, and this is probably the frontier in which to examine research methodology, and to examine performance itself in general. So finally, these are some of the questions that I have at the moment in terms of neurosthetics. Like, can an isolated series of movements or facial expressions, and I'm talking about specifically with non-visual art, truly elicit an aesthetic response from subjects being tested in a laboratory? Can you bring a laboratory to an auditorium? Maybe one day,
Yeah.
but we don't have the technology in place for it. Can we bring, like Paris is interested in political art, which takes place in a public space. Can we test subjects like that in a laboratory setting in a public space at the time? No, because we don't have the technology for it. We don't have the research methodology in place to do that. Can aesthetic response to dance or theater be reliably measured without all of the necessary embellishments required in formal performance. Again, this is an ideological dilemma. Some styles of dance require lots of external factors, like Indian classical dance. We have a costume, which I'm not wearing. We have stage makeup. We have an ethos that we create that's part of our aesthetic. That's not true of contemporary dance, in which there's a general disregard for costuming that takes away from movement itself, or that draws attention to the dancer. So how do you wrestle with such a wide spectrum of what performance is? And finally, how can neuroaesthetics further inform and expand performance studies? As I said, it offers an alternative lens by which to look at performance from a more empirical perspective, which allows us, I feel like, to ground certain principles that we read in theory, and what are its scientific analogs, or what is science showing that is different from what is there in performance theory. And so they should inform each other more often, because just to share an anecdote today, in Paris's presentation, I kind of challenged his manifesto with my sort of empirical way of thinking about psychology and how it relates to when you're dealing with large groups of people. So this is where science becomes highly rigid. But at the same time, it also gave weight to Paris's ideas in a broader sense. Like, where is it that we can see evidence where his manifesto may actually work? Or where's there evidence where it may not work? So this is how I feel like science in general, whether it's neuroscience or neuroaesthetics or psychology, can sort of have a dialogue with performance studies. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I present you a list of further reading.